Irene Butter, From Holocaust to Hope.
I am so pleased to be here with my wonderful friends and co-writers, Chris Holloway and John Bidwell, who played a critical role in making this book what it has become. It has been a long, wonderful, intimate journey together. The three of us have known each other for a long time. Chris was my student in the School of Public Health after she and John returned from spending time in Mali in the Peace Corps. We quickly became friends, and I bonded with Aiden and Liam, their sons, when they were babies. We stayed in touch after they moved to New England and saw each other whenever possible. In its first iteration, this memoir was a very different kind of book. Chris and John were also writing a book. During one of our conversations, our book conversations, and I don't remember exactly how it happened, we decided to embark on a new path. The three of us would work on this memoir together. Now, you may wonder, how do three people write a book together? And that's a good question. We can talk about it a little bit later on. So this evening, first of all, a guiding principle throughout our journey was to recapture the voice of the child at each stage of this narrative. There are many memoirs about the Holocaust, yet how children lived through these experiences, what they heard, what they saw, and what they felt has rarely been revealed. We will do 4 short readings that showcase the voice from 4 different sections of the book. Chris will read a section about early childhood, when life was still safe and filled with joy. I will read about Westerbork and how Werner, my brother, is trying to convey a sense of looming terror and tragedy. John will read a scene from Bergen-Belsen showing how hardship infiltrated family relationships. And I will end with a section from the postscript, which contains core themes and closing messages. And there will be time for questions after the readings. So, Chris, it's your turn.
All right, so Irene was born in 1930, so I know she doesn't look a day over 70 to any of you. And so an important part for me of writing the book was to portray the early years before all the horror happened, partly because, as Irene said, she was my advisor at the School of Public Health, and it was maternal and child health, and I so happened to give birth and to our 2 sons while I was getting my degree. So I was probably one of the few lactating females with a toddler in the program, and I don't know if I would have made it through without her support. The school here, U of M, is a pretty intense school, and she supported me the whole way. And so I knew her as someone who loved women and babies and children, and so that idea that she was once an innocent kid who had fun and played and had an Oma and an Opie who loved her, her grandparents and a brother and friends, was really important for me to understand her family and her childhood. So I relished writing these early pages in particular. So the scene I want to read is it's actually, Irene is in Amsterdam. It's about 1939. So she's lived in Amsterdam for a couple years, having escaped Berlin. Her father knew it was not looking good and thought Amsterdam was far enough away. History shows it was not. So this is a scene, it's in the summer. She is riding her bicycle outside on a summer evening with her brother Werner, her friend Vera, and a boy she had a crush on, though she ended up with the best boy, Charlie, here in the front row, at the time. So that's the scene. With summer's start, the sun strengthened, stretching out its warm light farther into the evening. It was June 1941, and Vera, Werner, and I stayed outside as long as possible. Along the nearby canal, we gathered on our bikes to ride along the water's edge. My metal horse and Vera's were fast friends as they flew along at a full gallop. We grasped the looping handlebars and steered the big wheels ahead. Go! At night, the brick paths along the canals were smooth trails. We barely felt the jiggling space between the bricks as our fat tires traveled over them. The young families were at home and people roamed leisurely in twos. We sped along, heady with the early night smells of pollen and full leaves. Werner was strongest and could fly up the bridges and back down long before we could. Up and down and around. My ears jumped between the sounds of birds settling in for the night, bugs waking up, water lapping at the canal walls, a far-off barrel organ, and our chains rhythmic straining against the gears. We picked up Rudy from his home. He was almost as fast as Werner and twice as graceful. His long legs and arms moved like a dancer's. We took over a street and rode side by side, all four of us. Evening light slowly turned on here and there, reflections shining up from the water in shimmering light. We came upon a small park in the middle of a square with winding brick paths around small shrubs and statues. Rudy pedaled up, wound between the blackened shrubs, and disappeared. Werner came to a halt at the entrance and held up his hand for Vera and me to stop. We backpedaled on the brakes, both of us sliding into the back of his bike with a crack. Tacked up on a tree was a sign, Voor Joden verboden, Jews forbidden. It was a new sign. In the lower right corner was an official police seal. Rudy, come back, Werner called, fear edging into his voice. Rudy, I called. I looked at the deserted streets and whispered to the night to let him come back before anyone saw. He flew back around the corner just then, almost knocking into us, his eyes wide and filled with light. Werner pointed to the sign. Rudy stopped smiling. All of our bikes, like eager steeds, strained to go on, but we turned back. Our horses had turned into just bicycles.
Well, from here on, the situation went from bad to worse. There were more and more restrictions for Jews, making life increasingly dangerous. Then came the deportation. First, we were arrested once, locked up in a theater for a couple of days, and then released. The second time the deportation was for real, and we were taken to a transit camp in the Netherlands called Westerbork. The passage from which I will read is a conversation between Werner, my brother, and myself. Werner was 2 years older than I, and he had a job as a messenger in Camp Westerbork. He had a much better understanding of what was going on than I did. We had been looking for my friend Rudy, a boy from my class that I had a crush on. He and his family were deported sometime before us to Westerbork, and I was counting on seeing him again once we arrived in the camp. A cattle car train arrived each Saturday afternoon in Camp Westerbork. The boxcars were there, the doors open, looking empty and hungry. No matter where I was in the camp, that weekend, there was the train. When I went to the bathroom, when I went to dinner, when I hung out the clothes to dry, when we visited friends in other barracks, you could not miss that train. I noticed numbers were written on the cars, like 74 persons on the sides of the car. Werner said this was the number of people each car held on the previous trip. Smears of past numbers were there, too, as faded, as smudged, and unreadable, just like the people that these numbers represented. Carefully counted, quickly erased, on to the next. This evening at dinner, Werner was less talkative about his work and what he was hearing. His excitement about his work had faded. His lips were tightly pressed, and he was biting his nails. "What is it?" I asked as we sat outside on the steps of our barracks. "Nothing," he replied. "Leave me alone. Don't hassle me about your Rudy." "He's not my Rudy," I said. Werner didn't make a comeback, nor did he tease me or get frustrated so much about my bugging him. Rainy, that was my nickname. Everybody called me Rainy. "Rainy," he said, picking at his cuticles, "you know this is a transit camp, right? A camp that sends people to other places." "Yeah, tell me something new," I answered. "You know," he said, "I've been looking high and low for Rudy, like you have. His family was here, but they boarded the train, a few weeks before we arrived here. He's gone. I found out yesterday." "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. He paused, and then he said, "Because I heard other things as well, and I wanted to check on them before telling you. Rudy left for that camp Auschwitz. Auschwitz is worse than here, a lot worse." "How can Auschwitz be worse than here?" I answered. "We've been taken from our home. Who knows who has all the stuff we left behind? We're bored here and doing stupid work. The food we brought with us is gone, and the camp only has gross soup and stale bread. And we have to use open bathrooms without doors." I felt panic rising in my voice. "Rainy, you don't understand. I understand that you didn't tell me about Rudy when you found out. They don't just bore you or even starve you in Auschwitz," said Werner. They kill you. I had to hear it a lot before I believed it. They kill people at camps like Auschwitz. They kill Jews like us and like Rudy." And his voice rose, and he choked at the last sentence.
The section I'm going to be reading is from late spring 1944. Irene and her family are in Bergen-Belsen, which is a concentration camp after having spent 8 months in Westerbork. This is a period when there's a large influx of prisoners that are beginning to go to Bergen-Belsen from other camps, usually the sick. This means there's a lot of strain put on the camps. There's less food. The barracks are becoming more crowded. Hunger is a theme that you often hear in concentration camps, and one of the things that we've tried to do here is to show it rather than tell it, to try to capture it. The hunger there was really persistent. It was very difficult. There was only one meal a day. It was usually a soup or a porridge at night. And then there was a hunk of bread that was given, and the family was to rely on that for the next 24 hours. They did usually receive something to drink in the morning, something called a surrogate coffee, which is to say it was coffee not made of coffee beans, but made of weeds, acorns, and anything else that could be found. At first, hunger was a pesky neighbor, sometimes noisy at night, interrupting sleep. Then it was a nagging visitor who came rapping on the door more and more. Finally, it had the keys. Hunger marched in and settled down. As the spring months dragged on and the cold raced across the camp, through every crevice, under every blanket, hunger went from a distant stranger to an annoying acquaintance, and then to a constant companion. There was no place to escape, no room to retire to. It became an ever-present, day after day rumbling. As mothers, fathers, and relatives started returning from work in the late afternoons, I left my job tending to smaller children to wait in the long line with other kids and some adults to get our daily rations. With food becoming increasingly scarce, adults started pushing the kids out of the way. I watched carefully. It always paid to be attentive when it came to food. If needed, I would ask the server for more vegetables scooped from the bottom of the pot. I always measured the size of the hunk of bread. If needed, I protested. I wasn't loud, but I was quick. Then I returned to our bunks, and I waited. I sat on my bunk, arms around our pail, pulling what warmth I could from the pail and inhaling the smell. Hunger sat beside me, whispering in my ear to eat it all. It would be so easy. There wasn't much, and for the first time in a year, I could go to bed with a full stomach. I slid my finger around the inside edge of the pail, feeling the moisture build to drops. When no one was looking, I put a shaky finger to my tongue. My senses bounced between the all-absorbing taste and listening for my family's approaching footfalls, my mother's delicate gait, and my father's longer shuffle. The barracks darkened. It became evening. The food cooled. Every few minutes, I collected drops of soup, telling myself it would have evaporated anyhow. I couldn't wait anymore. With careful measure, I took my portion of the food and devoured it. Instead of feeling better, I found myself ravenous. I dipped my spoon with a shaking hand into the pail and a few more times and picked off what I could from the uneven ends of the bread. As the food hit my lips, my body wanted to slurp down every last drop and chew every last crumb. Maybe this is how vampires feel about blood, I thought. I kept thinking I heard my family only to realize I was wrong. Then there was no mistake. I was terrified that they would say something about the portions or read my guilt. But I was also relieved that I was free of further temptation. They said nothing. My father sat, took off his worn-out shoes, lay down, and closed his eyes. I looked at my mother, who stayed upright but leaned her head against the frame of our bunk. "Okay, Irene, do you have anything hearty for us?" my father asked after a few minutes. In the past, he might have added that he was starving. "Of course," I said, and took the brown pot from underneath my blanket. "Have you seen Werner?" my mother asked. I shook my head. She took a deep breath, looking around. My father moved beside her, resting his hand on her bony leg. They both looked at me and nodded. They refused to eat until I did. "I already had mine," I said. "Do you need more?" my father asked. "No, I'm fine." "Take more, Irene," my mother said. "I'm not hungry." "I'm fine. My belly doesn't feel well today," I lied. And then seeing their concern, quickly added, "But it's not that bad, my belly, I mean." And so they passed the brown pot and the bread, saving more than Werner's share for him.
A lot happened after the incident in Bergen-Belsen John just described. About 6 months later, my family and I were included in a prisoner exchange that liberated us from Bergen-Belsen. My puppy died on the way to freedom. I was sent to a displaced persons camp in Algeria, North Africa, and came to the United States a year later, in 1945, on a Liberty ship. After arrival in the United States, I did not speak about the Holocaust for 4 decades. In 1986, I was asked to serve on a panel about Anne Frank at the Detroit Holocaust Memorial Center. It was a turning point for me. During the panel question and answer period, it dawned on me that Anna wasn't here to tell her story, but I was. Yes, there was a diary, but Anna and 6 million others had been forced into silence. I was 56 years old and had chosen to stay silent. I had survived. Why? Was there a message attached to my survival? Was I supposed to do something great? My life was so good. My marriage and my career were successful, and my children were healthy. How could I pay back for the privilege of being alive? I knew I must bear witness to suffering and use my experiences to lessen the burden of others. My silence had helped other people to forget the Holocaust. And silence meant that the dead would have died in vain. But action was hard. I was still locked in the habit of being quiet and was also scared to revisit my past, to visit my past too closely. Some memories cut to the soul. Yet I knew that silence about what had happened to me during the Holocaust was no longer an option. I thought of my parents, especially my puppy, and all they had sacrificed for me. I had to exhibit that kind of courage and be the voice that others were denied. So I began to speak, and I have not been quiet since. What surprised me most was that students who were the same age as I when I lived through the concentration camps were interested in my story. At first, I was afraid to speak about my personal history in front of hundreds of middle and high school students. Looking back, I was most afraid of being laughed at or being judged, being misunderstood, or facing an auditorium of yawns and blank stares. But the unexpected happened. Not only did students listen and ask good, hard questions, but also they wrote to me afterwards. They wrote to me to share reflections on my story and also to share their own stories. They wrote me about losing a loved one and of being bullied, of of having someone stick up for them and of sticking up for another person. And of feeling discrimination against, feeling being discriminated against and not letting it get them down. From inner city schools in Detroit, schools in Ann Arbor, and rural middle schools in Dexter, students in what has become my home state of Michigan are ready to hear a message of standing up against hatred, against bullying, against oppression and discrimination. They seem naturally disposed to wanting to stand up, to stand in the shoes of others with compassion. Students recognize that all of us are responsible for each other, regardless of our color, religion, or race. We are all hungry for stories of hope and triumph over tragedy. Their writings, drawings, and poems hearten me and give me the motivation to push through the pain and keep talking and sharing. The idea of never a bystander, standing up for others, even when they are not members of your tribe, is a strong theme in my life's work. With this idea in mind, I helped found the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture Series at the University of Michigan. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swede, not a Jew, who risked and lost his life in order to save tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews at the end of World War II. He is one of the greatest heroes of the war. Each year, since 1990, the Wallenberg Lecture brings an outstanding humanitarian here to give a talk receive a medal, and inspire students and all of us to serve. The lecture's motto is, "One person can make a difference in building a better world." With that motto, I remember Papi's contact and the Swedish man who helped get our Ecuadorian passports. I may never know them, and the Swede was not Raoul Wallenberg, but they were people who took a risk to help when they were needed, even though there were plenty of excuses to do otherwise. I also co-founded a women's group in Ann Arbor called Zaytuna, named for the olive tree, a symbol of peace. It's a way of building a bridge between two people who don't ordinarily connect with one another. Zaytuna is a group of 6 Palestinian and 6 Jewish women. We refuse to be enemies. We find common language, common ground, and have even traveled to Israel and Palestine to experience our homeland together. I am now 87 years old, and like many women of my tender age, I find great joy in my grandchildren. My granddaughters were born in Israel to a Jewish mother, my daughter, and a Palestinian father. This has not always been easy for them. But I've learned that the surest path to peace may be when the other becomes your own. My grandson born in San Francisco, is 10 years old, and he's the youngest of the bunch. In a few years, he will be the age that I was when I was in the camps. He looks at the world with eyes full of wonder and feet always ready to explore. I talk about my past for him. He is Papi's grandson, after all. The family courses through his veins. I also do it for his classmates, for Vitek. Vitek was a little boy I took care of in Algiers in the camp, an orphan. And I do it for young people everywhere. They give me hope that we will lay aside our differences and build a better world together. One world, one family.
This program was recorded on May 8th, 2018 at the Ann Arbor District Library.